Okay, so I am live here, 52 weeks of Swift programming language. This is the second session. And really the idea here is that each week I'm going to do a little bit in the language guide. So I'm going to start off with the basics of the language this week, get into it a little bit, go over strings and characters, collection types. Really, this is going to take a while, right, to go through the language. And it'll be anywhere from, let's say, a half an hour to an hour. And I'll also show some other things that are related to the Swift language, including the Xcode ecosystem. And so I think that's probably one of the best things I'll start with today is a little bit of a stealth share here that many people aren't aware of, is that you can do button click machine learning by using Xcode. There's a tool called CreateML, and it's actually amazing. And if you are wondering whether you should get into machine learning and computer vision, and you've always wanted to kind of kick the tires a little bit, I'm going to help you get started with that. And then once I show that demo and show how that works, then I'm going to move on to doing this in playgrounds, and we'll do a little bit of the language guide. And then again, next week, I'll go to the next section of language guide, and pretty soon we'll be able to at least get past the language guide. And I'll probably build some applications along the way as well. So what I'm going to do is share my screen here, and I'm going to share my entire screen because I had some issues before. And in this particular scenario here, I'm going to show a second monitor I've got here. And here's the first thing I'm going to start off with is this thing called CreateML. And this is part of Xcode. So you just right click on Xcode, this thing pops up. And what's really cool about this CreateML system is that you can do machine learning by just clicking a button. It'll just train these models for you automatically. I've been doing machine learning for a long time now, and almost 10 years actually, been doing production machine learning. And I've had to write code in Python, R, all these other languages. But in this case, I don't have to do anything. I can just click a button. So what I'm going to pick on is this first one, image classification. And I go to next, and it's going to say, okay, image classifier. I'm going to call this dogs and cats. This is kind of the traditional thing that people like to do. And we'll go to next. And then it's going to ask me where to put this. Let's go ahead and put it on the desktop. And now that I've got this CreateML thing set up, let's take a look at some of the things that you get access to. So to start with, notice here that it says my model source, it has my project, it has training data, and this is where I would want to start. So the way machine learning works is it learns from data. And so in this case, I need to give it some images to be trained on. So I'm going to click on training data, and I'll go through here, and I've actually got these right on my desktop. So I'll go to desktop, and I've actually got cats and dogs right here. Perfect. And notice inside of this folder, in fact, let me just pop it open so you can take a look at this, that inside of this folder here is literally just some pictures of cats and dogs, right? So we've got cats here, right? And we can just take a look at one of these cat pictures here. And then we've got, dogs, all these things. And I guess I could look at them as a gallery. That might be a better way to take a look at it. And we can see all the different pictures, right? Kind of cool. We have these dogs and cats. So what do I want to do? Well, it can do the validation data automatically. So this is basically testing my result once I've trained it to make sure I don't do overfitting. And then this is a neat thing that is very complicated in code, is that I could add noise, for example. I could blur it, crop it, expose it, flip it. So I can make the model more robust against, like the real world, essentially. And I could just click these data augmentations by training it. But just because I'm going to do a very quick demo, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to click on train. Once we go through here, it goes through and it trains my model, very, very quickly here. And then it probably takes, all of, 10 seconds here to get this thing running. We can go to the evaluation, and what this means is that I could actually go through, and just for speed, I'm not going to download anything from the internet. I'm just going to drop one of these on here. So we'll just go through here and drag this onto testing data, choose, select, here we go. Go to my desktop here, go to this picture. There we go. Actually, I want to, sorry, I'm not on the testing data. I want to go to the preview and click on this icon here, drag images. And then basically it goes through and it shows me there's confidence. Same thing, I can drag another one, right? So basically I trained a machine learning model within 10 seconds. I've got to, build out here, and I don't need to do anything else. Now, if I want to take this model and do something with it, notice that it shows me the size of it. And in fact, I could actually share it. I could just click on share, or I could get it, and it will just go through and it'll download something called .ml model, so core ML. So definitely pretty cool to play around with if you haven't played around with it before. You can also import this in like a Jupyter notebook, or even bring it into an Xcode project as well, which is pretty cool, and build out a project based on the model that you train. So definitely worth playing around with if you get a chance. Okay, so that's just one of the little things I was going to demo today. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to get into the language guide here and just start at the very beginning. We'll start at the basics of the language, and I'm going to go over to Xcode, and I'm going to open up a new environment. So I'm going to go over here and just say, create a new project, and we're going to say, in fact, we want to create a new playground. And so in my scenario, let's cancel this. Let's go to File, New Playground. And it'll ask us what we want to do. We want to do a blank playground, and we'll say next. And what do we want to call this thing? Well, let's leave it in our Swift code here, and I'll call this episode 2, and we'll call this one the basics. There we go, the basics. Okay, so we got a Xcode playground here, which is pretty cool, and now I can actually start writing code. So I'm going to leave this thing up high here. Maybe make it a little bit bigger. Maybe make the text a little bit bigger. And then I can just go side by side here and just play around with the basics. So the first thing we need to play around with is I'm going to follow the language guide here. And to start with, we know about declaring constants and variables. So the idea here is that what we want to do is make sure that we understand the difference. So in the case of constants and variables is that if you do let, it's permanent, right? So we'll say let foo equals 1. But in the case of let's just move this over here. In the case of a var, you can mutate it. Var, and we'll just call this bar is equal to 2, right? So if I go through here and I just want to run one of these things, what happens? Well, we know in this particular example that this var is set, this foo is set, and if I want to just say print foo, we can print that out. And if I want to print bar, we can print that out. But I can mutate bar. So if I say bar, for example, is equal to 3, like that, basically it will allow us to do that. But if I want to go through here and do a foo is equal to 3, it's not going to let me do it because it's an immutable variable. So that's one of the big takeaways here, right? So that we can't do that. So that's a good lesson. We got that one that we're learning. The next thing that we can go through here is take a look at type annotation. So the idea here is that a type annotation for a variable indicates the variable can store string values. So this is maybe new to people from languages like Python, but basically you just tell the type ahead of time. So we'll call this type annotation, and we'll go through here and we'll just paste this in. So var, welcome message string. So this means that this is going to be a string, and then if I go through here and I put this in, what happens? Well, it allows me to basically know that it's going to be a string. Now, if I go through here and I want to do basically multiple related variables, we can also do that right here. Go var red, and these are all doubles, right? So type annotation is good because it allows us to have better support in our editor, for example. Now, another thing we can talk about is naming constants and variables. So here we go. We say let pi. It's pretty cool that we can use this pi symbol here to assign things. You can also do these Unicode characters as well, which is pretty cool, right? So very good support for Unicode characters. The next thing that we can do is we can actually change a variable, right? We already talked about that earlier, but right, because this is var, I don't have to go through and do anything tricky. We can actually just change it because it's a mutable variable, but these other ones we can't. We can print by doing print. We already did that. The next thing we can do is comments. So I guess I've already been doing this, but the comments in Swift would be like this. This would be the comments. Pretty straightforward, right? Just a couple 2 forward slashes. We also can do multi-line comments. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go through here and let's do a multi-line. So we will go through here and notice how the playgrounds will fill it out for me. And we can just say this is a big section of comments. And so this would be if I'm going to maybe document a bunch of stuff about the Swift language, to use this API, do the following, and you would put in a bunch of steps here, maybe 1, 2, 3, something like this. That's why you would use these wrapped lines, which are very good, especially if it's, some kind of SDK or something like that. Notice that the semicolons here are something that you can use. For example, it doesn't require that you put a semicolon after each statement, but you can if you want to. So this is kind of cool. Let's go ahead and try this out. We'll call this semicolons. Now I like this because this is a lot like Python, which there is a history there, right? And so if I want to say let dog, right, I can just say 3, and then we can also do the same thing. We can say print dog, right? So pretty neat that I don't have to put a semicolon here. Integers, you can actually set minimum, maximum values for integers. I'll kind of flip through some of these things, which are not as fun. Like, those are more like reference things, like the floats. But I'm going to scroll down to type conversion. That's a little bit more fun. So, there's a bunch of things with Swift that you can do in terms of integer conversion. And in particular, here's an example. We can just copy this whole thing in, and we can go and we can say, integer conversions here. Integer conversions. How does it work? We go through here and we just paste this in, and you can see that the uint can't store negative values, and so this will report an error. So that's kind of cool. You can store things and tell it basically what kind of integer value it can be, including negative or positive. If you also can do integer and floating point conversions here, and so for example, if you had let 3, right, you could actually go through here and again, this is a immutable variable. And then if I want to go through here and I want to go through and do some kind of conversion. So if I want to convert that immutable variable by using a double, pretty neat. I just call double, right? And now I can actually use it that way. Type aliases. This is an alternative name for an existing type, right? So you can go through here and create these type aliases, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure all the use cases for that. Booleans, right? These are definitely pretty useful. Booleans. Let's go through here and play around with those. And so we can say, oranges are orange, true. And we can say let turnips are delicious, false, right? And we can say, and so then basically you can use those in certain statements. Like, I think one of the better ones to play around with is you can say if turnips are delicious, right? So basically you evaluate the true or false nature of something, which again is very Python-like. Here we can actually go through here and we say, if the turnips are delicious, print tasty turnips. Otherwise, print turnips are horrible. And so in this case, we would go through here and say that these are actually horrible. So the next thing that we can do is we can go to tuples. These are pretty common again with Python. And so let's actually maybe even just delete all this and start over again because there's a compile error. And I'm going to say a tuple in Swift here, which would be like this. We would say let HTTP 404 error 404 not found, right? So a tuple would just be basically these two things inside. And so there's a lot of things you can do with a tuple. For example, you can decompose. And this is actually pretty common, again, very similar to Python, where you do multiple assignment, right? You grab something that's got two things and you just unpack it together, right? And then we could just type in status code like that, and then we see that it actually prints out. So that's kind of cool. And you can also do similar things. You can ignore things. Again, this is very similar to Python as well, being able to ignore things that you unpack. You can also use optionals where values may be absent. And so, in this particular example, you can see that this initializes to try to convert a string into an integer. You can also set an optional variable to a valueless state by assigning it the special value nil, right? So here we go. Let's go ahead and grab these in, and we can go through here and paste this in. We say var server response, and then we can go ahead and set that to nil. So if statements and forced unwrapping. So you can use an if statement to find out whether an optional it contains a value by comparing it against nil. So basically, this is also really Python-like, where you would say, basically, if the value is not empty, then go through and do something. So, when would you use something like this? So let's say you make an API call to a JSON payload of some kind, and then you go through here and you go, okay, let's try it out. And then it turns out there's nothing. Well, you would maybe say, like, as long as it's not empty, go ahead and do this other thing. So that's a very common, logical operation that you can do. So optional binding is kind of an interesting one. So you can use optional binding to find out whether an optional contains a value, right? So you would say if let this. And so you can rewrite possible number, example from optionals, to use optional binding. So you'd say if let the number, then basically do this else statement. What else can you do here that's kind of interesting? Implicitly unwrapped optionals. So optionals can be checked with an if, right? So there's a lot of these little conditional logic things that are really common in many languages, where you basically are checking for values, and if there's a certain thing is null, then you do this other thing. Or if you basically have something that's optional, you can set it. So these can be handy as well. So what about error handling? So error handling is definitely something that you want to handle in a modern language, and you can see basically when a function encounters an error, it throws an error, and then you can catch that error. So for example, if you tried to open up a file, that's a very classic error handling thing. You could handle that exception and basically go through and do that. And so if we go through here and we paste this in, function, can you throw an error? We go through this and we say, okay, well, no, this function may or may not throw an error. What else can we do here? So in this case, here's an example of how error handling can be used to respond to different errors. So again, the idea with this particular function is that you basically throw this thing out and you say, depending on what it is that it does, this is a try catch type error exception here, where you would go through it and you would basically, like, let's take a more abstract value would be if you were getting this certain kind of exception, then do this other thing. If the exception is this other type of exception, then maybe save the file, right? So this is more of a logical statement. Now, assertion is something that is also very common to do in the Python language. The PyTest, for example, has this. So for example, if I say let age equal -3, so let's go ahead and do this, right? You would say assert that as long as the age is basically a positive value, then go ahead and do something. Now, an assert would go through in here and say, hey, whoops, we got an assertion failure here. We can't proceed through the rest of our code. And again, this is very similar in Python when you do an assert with a unit test with PyTest, is that you assert some value. If it doesn't reach that value, and so this is pretty neat because, again, depending on what it is you're trying to do, the assertion would just stop everything, and you wouldn't want to go further. The other thing you could do is you could enforce preconditions, for example, as another example. So in a nutshell, I was able to tackle the real basics of the Swift language here, which was kind of neat to be able to handle all that. And so I'll be able to do next week. We can get into the next section of this guide, which would be covering the basic operations. But this was just the really basic stuff in Swift. Again, next week we'll go over basic operations, and I'll also try to give some more concrete code examples as well. But again, we're just going to go through the language guide each week, one by one, build out each of these sections, and then along the way potentially show you some demo codes that I have. So kind of a short session today. See you again next week, and talk to you soon.